A millionaire spots a homeless woman with triplets on a cold city street. Something about her feels hauntingly familiar. Then it hits him. She's not just any woman. She's his childhood love, the one he lost 7 years ago. But when he steps closer, the triplets turn toward him and his breath catches. How did she end up on the streets? Why did she disappear from his life? And what happens when he discovers the truth about what his family did to her? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The rain pounded against the gleaming glass doors of the Waldorf Astoria as Daniel Mercer stepped out into the Manhattan night. His Italian leather shoes splashed in puddles, but he barely noticed. The Watson Tech merger documents consumed his thoughts, another billion-dollar deal that would make headlines tomorrow. The familiar weight of success sat heavily on his shoulders, yet somehow felt emptier than usual. A gust of wind whipped his expensive coat, sending icy droplets against his face. He raised his hand to signal his waiting driver when movement across the street caught his eye. Under a worn storefront awning, a thin black woman huddled with 3 small shapes pressed against her, trying to shelter them from the relentless downpour. Daniel's heart stopped, then lurched painfully in his chest. That profile, those delicate features even worn by exhaustion and worry. He knew that face, had dreamed of it for 7 years, had searched for it in every crowd until he'd finally forced himself to stop hoping. Amira, he whispered, the name feeling foreign on his tongue after so long, like a forgotten language suddenly remembered. She was gently shushing one of the children, her arms wrapped protectively around all 3 little girls. Even from across the street, he could see how frail she looked, her coat threadbare and damp, her dark hair plastered to her face by the rain. The sight hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his knees weak. Thunder cracked overhead as Daniel stepped off the curb, drawn forward like a man in a trance. As he got closer, he could see the children clearly now. Identical triplets, around 6 or 7 years old. His legs went weak as one of them looked up, her small face a mirror of Amira's, but with one striking difference. Those eyes. His eyes. The same deep brown that stared back at him from every mirror, now gazing at him from a tiny face that made his world stop spinning. The world tilted on its axis as understanding crashed over him. These weren't just any children. These were his children, daughters he never knew existed. The revelation shook him to his core, shattering every certainty he'd built his life upon. "Amira," he said louder, his voice rough with shock and desperate recognition. Her head snapped up. For one endless moment, their eyes met across the rain-slicked sidewalk. The hatred that blazed in her gaze knocked the air from his lungs. But underneath that fury, he saw something that gutted him even more. Raw, devastating pain that spoke of years of struggle and betrayal. "Stay back," she warned, gathering the girls closer. Her voice was hoarse but steel-hard, the voice of a mother protecting her young. "Mommy, I'm tired," whimpered one of the girls, stumbling slightly against Amira's leg. Her small shoulders trembled with exhaustion. "I know, Simone, baby. Just a little further," Amira soothed. But Daniel could hear the strain in her voice, the desperate edge of someone at their breaking point. He took another step forward, hands raised in supplication. "Please let me—" "Don't!" Amira's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare come near us!" She began backing away, steering the girls toward a narrow alley, her movements precise despite her obvious fatigue. Simone stumbled again, clearly exhausted, her small face pale in the harsh streetlights. Daniel's body moved instinctively to help, but Amira's fierce glare froze him in place, pinning him like a butterfly to a board. "Stay away from my daughters," she spat, the words dripping with 7 years of bitterness and pain that cut him to the bone. Daniel could only watch, paralyzed as they disappeared into the darkness of the alley. His chest constricted with an unfamiliar sensation, raw, primal panic unlike anything he'd ever felt before. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, Daniel Mercer felt completely and utterly helpless, watching his unknown family slip away into the rainy night like ghosts he'd never known to mourn. Hours later, Daniel paced his penthouse suite like a caged animal, his usual composure shattered. The night's rain still clung to his clothes, leaving dark patches on his $1,000 suit, but he barely noticed. His mind kept replaying the image of Amira and those 3 little girls, his daughters, huddled in the cold, their thin jackets no match for the bitter wind. The soft whoosh of the elevator announced Lucas's arrival. His assistant of 7 years stepped into the living room, tablet in hand, ready for their usual late-night strategy session. One look at Daniel's ashen face made him stop short. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Lucas said, setting down his tablet and frowning with concern. Daniel ran a trembling hand through his hair, droplets of rain scattering from the dark strands. "I found her, Lucas." His voice cracked like thin ice. "I found Amira." Lucas's eyes widened. He knew the story, how Daniel had searched for years after she disappeared, hiring private investigators and following every lead, how her absence had haunted him through endless sleepless nights. "She has kids," Daniel continued, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. 3 of them, girls, my girls. He sank onto the leather couch, his legs unable to hold him anymore. The expensive leather squeaked beneath him as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "They're mine, Lucas. I have daughters." Lucas sat down heavily across from him, the gravity of the situation evident in his tense shoulders. "Are you sure?" "They have my eyes." Daniel's voice was rough with emotion. Identical triplets. They must be 6 or 7 years old. The timing. He pressed his palms against his eyes, fighting back the burn of tears. "God, Lucas, what has she been through?" They were standing in the rain wearing clothes that barely fit them, hand-me-downs with holes and frayed edges. Within hours, Lucas had mobilized Daniel's considerable resources. Security footage, shelter records, and discreet inquiries led them to St. Mary's Women's Shelter on the edge of the city, a place worlds away from Daniel's luxurious penthouse. Daniel's sleek black Mercedes looked obscenely out of place as he pulled up to the building. The sight of the shelter made his stomach clench. Crumbling brick walls, windows patched with cardboard, graffiti marring the entrance. Trash collected in the corners of the small parking lot, and a broken swing set stood sentinel in what passed for a playground. The thought of Amira and his daughters living here made him physically ill. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on worn furniture and peeling wallpaper. The women in the common room looked up as he entered, their expressions hardening at his expensive suit and polished shoes. Some pulled their children closer, while others whispered behind raised hands. He felt their judgment like physical blows. A tired-looking volunteer approached him, her name tag crooked on her faded sweater. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Amira Bennett." The volunteer's face closed off immediately, her posture becoming defensive. "Ms. Bennett doesn't want to see you. Please leave." Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but movement at the top of the stairs caught his attention. Amira appeared, carrying a small figure wrapped in a thin blanket. Even from a distance, he could see Simone's face was flushed with fever, her small body trembling. Dark curls stuck to her forehead with sweat. Amira froze when she saw him. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the shabby lobby, 7 years of pain and questions hanging in the stale air between them. Then Simone coughed, the sound wet and painful, her whole body shaking with the force of it. The noise echoed off the bare walls like an accusation. Daniel stepped forward, his voice firm but gentle. "She needs a doctor." He could see the battle in Amira's eyes, pride warring with maternal desperation. Her fingers tightened on Simone's blanket as another harsh cough from their daughter made the decision for her. She gave a small, defeated nod. "My car's outside," Daniel said softly, already shrugging off his coat to wrap around Simone. As they walked to the Mercedes, he felt the weight of Amira's exhaustion, her fear, and the years of struggle that had brought them to this moment. The sound of their footsteps on the cracked pavement seemed to echo with second chances. The emergency room doors slid open with a soft hiss as Daniel rushed in, carrying Simone. Amira hurried beside him, her other 2 daughters clinging to her hands, their small feet struggling to keep up. The stark white walls and antiseptic smell were a sharp contrast to the musty shelter they'd just left, making the reality of their situation even more glaring. "I need help." Daniel's voice carried authority even in his panic, commanding attention from everyone nearby. Medical staff responded immediately, whisking Simone onto a gurney while a nurse with kind eyes gathered information, her pen moving quickly across the forms. Within minutes, they were moved to a private room where doctors began their examination, their movements efficient and practiced. The diagnosis came quickly: pneumonia, made worse by exposure to cold and damp conditions in the shelter. As the medical team worked to stabilize Simone, connecting her to monitors and starting IV antibiotics, Daniel watched through the window, his heart clenching at how small and fragile she looked in the hospital bed, her dark curls spread across the white pillow. When things calmed down, he found Amira in the hallway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if holding herself together. The harsh fluorescent lights highlighted the shadows under her eyes, the worry lines etched deeply in her face, and the threadbare condition of her coat. "Are they mine?" The words tumbled out before he could stop them, rough and urgent, his throat tight with emotion. Amira turned away, her shoulders tense, hands clenching into fists. "Does it matter?" "Of course it matters." Daniel stepped closer, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing other patients. "I need to know. I want a DNA test." "No." Amira's response was sharp, immediate, like a door slamming shut. She spun to face him, eyes blazing with protective fury. "You don't get to waltz back into our lives and claim them like a business acquisition. They're not some company you can take over with your billions." Daniel ran a frustrated hand through his disheveled hair, messing it up further. But looking at the girls, really looking at them, he already knew the truth. It was in their eyes, their features, the way they moved, the way Simone's nose crinkled just like his mother's had. These were his daughters. Hours passed slowly in the hospital room, marked only by the steady beeping of machines. The monitors showed Simone's condition stabilizing, but Amira couldn't relax. She paced like a caged tiger, checking on each daughter constantly, her movements betraying her bone-deep exhaustion and worry. Daniel could see the weight of her circumstances crushing her. No money, no stable home, 3 young lives depending entirely on her strength. He watched as she counted out the few crumpled dollars in her worn wallet, saw her trying to figure out how to feed the other girls while staying with Simone. The sight made his chest ache with a mixture of guilt and determination. "Amira," he said softly, careful not to startle her, "come stay at my house." She stiffened, immediately suspicious, her guard rising like a shield. "What?" "Just until Simone recovers," he clarified quickly, holding up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "No strings attached. There's plenty of room, and you'll be close to the hospital for follow-up appointments. The girls would have warm beds, good food." Amira's eyes narrowed to slits. "And then what? You'll have your lawyers take them away?" "No lawyers," Daniel promised, meeting her gaze steadily. "No custody battles, just a safe place to stay while Simone gets better. That's all I'm offering right now." He could see her weighing the options, pride battling with practicality as she stood there. Her gaze drifted to her daughters, one sick in a hospital bed, attached to tubes and wires, the other 2 curled up asleep in uncomfortable plastic chairs like exhausted puppies. Finally, she gave a small, defeated nod. "Just until Simone's better," she agreed reluctantly, each word seeming to cost her. For the first time since seeing Amira standing in the rain, Daniel felt hope bloom in his chest. Fragile, but real. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A tiny crack in the wall between them. The elevator doors opened to Daniel's penthouse, and Amira's heart hammered against her ribs. The space before her seemed to stretch endlessly, all gleaming surfaces and pristine furnishings. Everything looked expensive and untouchable, like a museum where children weren't allowed to run or play. The triplets stepped out behind her, their small gasps echoing in the vast space. Their eyes wandered from the crystal chandelier that cast rainbow patterns across the marble floor to the glossy black grand piano that stood like a sleeping giant near the windows. Those windows, they stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a view of Manhattan that made the city look like a glittering fairy tale. "Is this all yours?" Simone whispered, her voice filled with wonder. She reached for Daniel's hand without hesitation, making him start slightly at the contact. Daniel cleared his throat. "Yes, it is." Would you like to see your rooms?" His awkwardness was painful to watch. He moved stiffly like a robot trying to mimic human gestures. When Simone skipped alongside him, chattering about the sparkly lights, he nodded mechanically, clearly unsure how to respond to her enthusiasm. Nia hung back, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her expression could have frozen the Hudson River. Layla walked between her sisters, taking everything in with those observant eyes that missed nothing. Later at dinner, Daniel's discomfort became even more apparent. He'd ordered from what was probably the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan, dishes with French names and tiny portions arranged like artwork on bone china plates. "We're not used to fancy food," Nia said flatly, staring at her plate with undisguised contempt. Her words carried the weight of countless meals in shelters, of going hungry so her sisters could eat. Daniel's face crumpled for a moment before he caught himself. The shame in his eyes was raw, real. He looked at the elaborate spread as if seeing it for the first time, seeing how it must appear to children who had known true hunger. That night, Amira stood in the doorway of Simone's room, watching as Daniel attempted to tuck her in. His movements were uncertain, almost comical in their precision, as if he was following instructions from a manual on parenting. But he was trying. He smoothed the blanket with careful hands, adjusted the pillow just so. "Good night," he said formally. But Simone reached up and hugged him, making him freeze in surprise. "Night, Daddy," she mumbled sleepily. Something in Amira's chest tightened painfully. For just a moment, she saw past the expensive suit and carefully controlled expression. She saw the boy she'd loved in college, the one who used to make her laugh, who'd held her hand during thunderstorms, who'd promised her forever before everything fell apart. He was still in there, somewhere beneath the billionaire facade. But she couldn't afford to remember that boy, couldn't let herself soften toward this man. The stakes were too high now. After the girls were asleep, Daniel stood in the hallway between their rooms. His face showed a mixture of wonder and terror as he watched them through the open doors. His hands were clenched at his sides, his breathing uneven. The realization seemed to hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just about helping them anymore. He wanted more than that. He wanted his family back. Sunlight streamed through unfamiliar windows, and Amira blinked in confusion. For a moment, panic gripped her chest until the memories of the previous night flooded back. Daniel's penthouse. The pristine sheets felt foreign against her skin, too soft, too perfect, like sleeping on clouds after years of concrete. She sat up slowly, her body still remembering the hard shelter beds she'd grown accustomed to, every muscle protesting the sudden change in comfort. Down the hall, she could hear the gentle breathing of her daughters, punctuated by the occasional soft snore from Simone. Padding quietly to their rooms, her bare feet silent against the plush carpet, she found them sprawled in their beds, sleeping more peacefully than they had in months. Simone's fever had broken during the night, her cheeks now carrying a healthy pink glow instead of the sickly pallor from before. The sight made Amira's throat tight with emotion. The security of locked doors and warm rooms felt almost wrong after so long without them, like wearing someone else's clothes that didn't quite fit. Amira wrapped her arms around herself, repeating the words in her head like a mantra. This is temporary, just until Simone gets better. She couldn't afford to get comfortable, couldn't let herself believe in this illusion of safety. In the kitchen, Daniel was attempting to make breakfast, looking completely out of his element. He stood at the gleaming counter, surrounded by chaos, burnt toast piled on a plate, orange juice spilled across the marble surface, and what looked like pancake batter dripping onto the floor in thick globs. His usually immaculate suit was dusted with flour, patches of white marking his shoulders and sleeves, and his expression was one of pure concentration as he battled with the toaster, pressing buttons with growing frustration. Simone giggled from her seat at the counter, watching him with unrestrained delight. "You're doing it wrong, Daddy," she called out, swinging her legs happily beneath the counter. Nia sat as far from Daniel as possible, her posture rigid and defensive, picking at her burnt toast with obvious disdain. Her eyes occasionally flickered toward him with barely concealed suspicion. Layla's eyes darted between her mother and Daniel, her young face serious as she assessed the tension in the room, already trying to figure out how to keep the peace. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the scrape of utensils and Simone's occasional giggles at Daniel's domestic failures. The air felt thick with unspoken words and buried emotions. Finally, Amira couldn't hold back anymore, the question burning in her throat. "Why now, Daniel?" Her voice cut through the quiet morning air like a blade. "Why care after all these years?" Daniel set down the spatula he'd been holding, turning to face her fully. His eyes held no trace of the calculating businessman she'd seen last night, none of the corporate shark who could buy and sell companies without blinking. Instead, they carried raw honesty that made her heart stutter, a vulnerability she'd never expected to see from him. "Because I didn't know," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "And because I lost you once, I'm not losing you again." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and threat. Amira looked away, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze, the weight of 8 years pressing down on her shoulders. She'd built walls around her heart for 8 years, walls made of broken promises and lonely nights, of shelter beds and empty stomachs. She wasn't ready to believe him, couldn't afford to. The cost of being wrong was too high. Daniel wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, his movements deliberate and measured. "I'm having the DNA test done anyway," he said quietly, his tone careful but firm. "I don't need it to know the truth. I can see it in their faces. But if this goes to court, I need proof." Amira didn't respond. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, but her hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists, nails digging into her palms. Behind her, she could hear Simone asking Daniel for more pancakes, her sweet voice oblivious to the weight of what had just transpired, while the silence from her other daughters spoke volumes. Hours later, Daniel stood in his private elevator, the manila envelope burning a hole in his briefcase. Lucas had handed it to him with an understanding nod. The DNA results were in, but Daniel couldn't bring himself to open them. The truth was already written in Simone's smile, in Nia's stubborn chin, in Lila's thoughtful eyes. Science would only confirm what his heart already knew, what his soul had recognized from the first moment he'd seen them. "The Chen merger documents need your signature," Lucas said quietly, watching his friend's distracted expression. He'd never seen Daniel like this, so torn between his corporate responsibilities and the pull of family. "Later," Daniel muttered, his mind still in the penthouse where his daughters were probably having breakfast. The thought made his chest ache. How many breakfasts had he missed? How many moments had slipped away while he'd been blind to their existence? How many first steps, first words, first everything had he lost forever? Back in the penthouse, Amira wandered the vast space, feeling like an intruder in a museum. Everything was pristine, expensive, untouchable, from the Italian marble floors to the crystal chandeliers that caught the morning light. The girls were watching cartoons in the media room, their laughter echoing through the halls, but even that familiar sound felt strange bouncing off these perfect walls. It was like their warmth couldn't quite penetrate the cold luxury surrounding them. Her feet carried her past Daniel's home office and something caught her eye. There, among the business awards and formal photographs, sat a simple silver frame. Amira's breath caught in her throat. It was them, 8 years younger, sitting on the campus lawn. Her head was thrown back in laughter while Daniel looked at her with unguarded adoration. She remembered that day, before Walter, before everything fell apart. The memory was so vivid it hurt. The spring breeze, the scent of cherry blossoms, the way Daniel's hand had felt warm and safe in hers. He'd kept it. All these years, through his rise to corporate power, through whatever relationships he might have had, he'd kept this piece of their past. The realization made her heart flutter traitorously in her chest. A sharp knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Amira hesitated, then walked to answer it. The security system showed her who waited outside, and her whole body went cold, as if winter had suddenly invaded the warm penthouse. Walter Mercer stood in the hallway, impeccable in his tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. His eyes, so like Daniel's but utterly devoid of warmth, swept over her with calculated disdain. He looked exactly as she remembered from her nightmares. 7 years later and you still reek of bad decisions, he said, his cultured voice dripping with contempt. He stepped forward, forcing Amira to back up or be touched by him. You had your chance to disappear. Take your bastards and do it again. Each word was precisely chosen to cut deep, to remind her of her place in his worldview. Amira's hands trembled, but not from fear. This time, the emotion coursing through her veins was pure, white-hot anger. This man had destroyed her life once, had forced her to raise her children in shelters and cheap motels. He'd taken everything from her, her education, her dreams, her chance at happiness. She could still remember the bitter taste of defeat when she'd fled with her newborns, terrified and alone. But not anymore. She lifted her chin, meeting his cold stare with steady defiance. They're Daniel's daughters, she said, her voice clear and strong. And this time, I'm not running. The words rang through the penthouse like a declaration of war. Daniel stepped out of the elevator into his penthouse, his mind still wrestling with the unopened DNA results. But the moment he saw Amira's face, everything else faded away. She sat rigid on the leather couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her complexion ashen. What happened? He asked, dropping his briefcase. Your father was here. Her voice was steady, but he could see the tremor in her fingers. Daniel's vision blurred red at the edges. What did he say to you? The same thing he said 7 years ago, that I should disappear. Take the girls and run. Amira's eyes met his, and the pain there made his chest ache. He called them bastards, Daniel. The rage that swept through him was unlike anything he'd ever felt. Without a word, he turned and stormed back to the elevator. Where are you going? Amira called after him. To have a chat with my father. The drive to the Mercer estate felt endless. Daniel's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as memories flooded back. Amira's sudden disappearance, the weeks of searching, the hollow feeling that never quite went away, all because of his father. Walter was in his study when Daniel burst in, looking perfectly composed behind his massive mahogany desk. He didn't even flinch at his son's entrance. You knew, Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. You knew about them all along. Walter set down his pen carefully. Of course I knew. She was a distraction. I cleaned up your mess. Plus, the Mercer family needs somebody with class in the family, not a random woman off the streets. My mess? Daniel's laugh was harsh. You didn't clean up anything. You stole 7 years from me. 7 years of my daughter's lives. Please. Walter waved his hand dismissively. You weren't ready for fatherhood then. You're barely ready now. That wasn't your decision to make. Walter leaned back in his chair, studying his son with cold calculation. Here's the deal. Sign over Mercer Innovations, step away from your billions, and be a family man. His lips curved into a smirk. That's what you want, isn't it? To play house with your little ready-made family? Daniel stared at his father, seeing him clearly for the first time. This man who'd controlled every aspect of his life, who'd shaped him into the perfect heir, who'd stolen his chance at happiness because it didn't fit the plan. You think I won't do it? Walter's smile was victorious. I think you won't last a month without the power. Prove me wrong. Daniel didn't hesitate. He strode to the desk, yanked out the bottom drawer where he knew his father kept important documents, and pulled out the transfer papers. With steady hands, he signed his name on every dotted line, effectively giving away his entire empire. Walter's smile faltered. What are you doing? Proving you wrong? Daniel dropped the pen and straightened. You can have it, all of it. The money, the power, the legacy. It means nothing compared to what you took from me. He turned and walked out of his father's study, leaving behind billions of dollars and years of conditioning. With each step, the weight on his shoulders seemed to lift. He felt lighter than he had in years. Daniel stepped out of the elevator, his heart lighter despite giving away his fortune. The weight of years of corporate responsibility had lifted from his shoulders like a heavy cloak being shed. He found Amira in the living room where afternoon sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The girls were playing quietly nearby with some toys he'd bought them, their dark heads bent together over colorful building blocks. "Where did you go?" Amira asked, her eyes searching his face. There was worry there, and something else. A hint of fear that made his chest tighten. "To see my father." Daniel sat down across from her, his shoulders relaxed for the first time in years. "I signed over Mercer Innovations to him, all of it, every share, every patent, every building." Amira's eyes widened, her hand flying to her throat. "You what?" "I gave it up, the company, the money, everything." His voice was steady, certain. "I don't want any part of it anymore." She stared at him, shock written across her features, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "You gave up billions for what?" Daniel met her gaze steadily, his voice soft but sure. The answer was simple, had always been simple. For them. For you. Later that evening, Daniel insisted on having dinner together as a family. The dining room with its crystal chandelier and formal place settings felt too stuffy and intimidating, so they gathered around the kitchen island instead, where the atmosphere was warmer and more intimate. He'd ordered pizza, something simple that he knew the girls would like, topped with extra cheese and pepperoni. Nia picked at her slice suspiciously, examining each piece of pepperoni as if it might hide a secret, while Layla watched everyone's reactions carefully, her observant eyes moving from face to face. Simone, however, had already demolished half her piece with enthusiastic abandon, tomato sauce dotting her chin like tiny red freckles. "Want more?" Daniel asked, unable to hide his smile as he slid another slice onto Simone's plate, when she nodded eagerly, her curls bouncing with the movement. As the meal progressed, the tension began to ease like ice melting in spring. Layla asked him about his favorite books, her voice soft but curious, and even Nia seemed to listen when he described the adventures he used to read about, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. Simone giggled at his silly voices when he told stories, the sound like music in the warm kitchen, and for the first time, the apartment felt like a home rather than just an expensive space. After dinner, as Daniel helped clear the plates, feeling oddly satisfied by such a simple task, Simone tugged at his sleeve. Her eyes were heavy with sleep, and she swayed slightly on her feet like a tiny dancer losing her rhythm. "Good night, Daddy," she mumbled before shuffling off toward her room, trailing her favorite blanket behind her. Daniel froze, the plate in his hand forgotten. The kitchen fell silent, the only sound the distant hum of the city below. Amira stood stock still by the sink, her back rigid as a statue. Even Nia and Layla stopped what they were doing, watching for their mother's reaction, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Hours later, after the girls were asleep and the apartment had settled into nighttime quiet, Daniel found Amira standing on the balcony. The city lights twinkled below them, a sea of stars at their feet, while a cool breeze carried the faint sounds of traffic upward. He joined her, maintaining a careful distance, close enough to talk but far enough to respect her space. "I tried to find you, Daniel," Amira said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, nearly lost in the night air. "I swear I did." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He turned to look at her, really look at her, and saw the years of pain etched in her expression like lines in weathered stone. "What do you mean?" he asked, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. "When I found out I was pregnant, I tried everything. I called, I emailed, I went to your apartment." Amira's hands gripped the railing until her knuckles turned white. "But you were gone. Your number was disconnected, your email bounced back. The doorman said you'd moved away. It was like you'd vanished into thin air." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet, his world tilting on its axis. The truth he thought he knew, that she'd left him, that she hadn't wanted him, began to crumble like a sandcastle against the tide. For the first time he realized, maybe she never left him. Maybe she was taken from him, a precious thing stolen by unseen hands. The thought settled in his stomach like lead, heavy with implications about his father's role in their separation. The city lights sparkled below them like scattered diamonds, but Daniel barely noticed their beauty. His mind was spinning, trying to process Amira's words. For 7 years, he'd carried the weight of abandonment, believing she'd chosen to leave him behind. But now, watching her grip the balcony railing, her knuckles white with tension, he saw a different story written in the lines of her face and the shadows in her eyes. "What do you mean you tried to find me?" His voice came out rougher than intended, thick with emotion he couldn't quite contain. "I called you every day for weeks." Amira's words tumbled out, years of bottled pain finally finding release. Her shoulders trembled as she spoke. "Your number was suddenly disconnected. I emailed you dozens of times, nothing. When I went to your apartment, the doorman said you'd moved without leaving a forwarding address. I even waited outside your office building once, but security wouldn't let me in." Daniel felt sick, his stomach churning with a growing dread. He remembered that time differently, his father telling him Amira had moved on, that she wanted space, that trying to contact her would only make things worse. He'd believed it all, like a fool who couldn't see the manipulation right in front of him. The next morning, Daniel sat in his home office watching the girls eat breakfast through the open door. Simone was telling an animated story about her dreams, her hands waving in the air like butterfly wings, while Layla listened with patient attention, occasionally nodding and smiling. Nia sat apart from them, shoulders stiff, pointedly ignoring his presence, though he caught her stealing glances when she thought he wasn't looking. "Lucas," he spoke into his phone, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing the peaceful scene. "I need you to pull everything from 7 years ago. Phone records, emails, security footage from my old apartment building. Anything that might show what really happened between me and Amira. Leave no stone unturned." Throughout the day, Daniel tried to focus on the girls, determined to make up for lost time. He helped Layla with her math homework, stumbling through fractions and decimals, amazed by her patient explanations when he got confused. He let Simone teach him her favorite card game, though he suspected she made up half the rules just to see him smile. Nia remained a shadow at the edges of his vision, watching but never engaging, her dark eyes filled with questions she wouldn't voice. That evening, as he attempted to learn their bedtime routine, Amira appeared in the doorway. She watched him awkwardly trying to braid Simone's hair, his fingers clumsy but determined. The sight seemed to soften something in her expression. "Why did you really do it?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you leave Mercer Innovations?" Daniel set down the hairbrush, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Because I'm done letting them decide my life. I lost you once because of them. I won't let it happen again." His voice carried the weight of a promise. The truth of his words hung heavy in the air between them, filled with unspoken regrets and possibilities. Before Amira could respond, Daniel's phone buzzed. Lucas's name flashed on the screen. "Daniel!" Lucas's voice was tight with urgency. "You need to see this. Someone blocked every attempt Amira made to reach you. Every call, every email, deleted before they got to you. There's a clear pattern of interference." Daniel's blood turned ice cold as the pieces began falling into place. His hand gripped the phone so tight his knuckles turned white. All these years, all this pain, it hadn't been chance or choice. It had been orchestrated, carefully planned and executed, leaving both him and Amira thinking they'd been abandoned by the other. And he had a sickening feeling he knew exactly who was behind it all. Daniel stepped out of the elevator into his penthouse, his mind still reeling from Lucas's revelations. The weight of 7 years of lies pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden, making each step feel like he was wading through concrete. Before he could even set down his briefcase, angry voices echoed through the hallway, bouncing off the pristine walls. "How can you just pretend everything's okay?" Nia's voice cracked with emotion, raw and unfiltered. "How can you act like this is normal? Like we're some happy family?" "Nia, please." Amira's voice was strained, trying to keep calm despite the tremor in her words. "This isn't about pretending. We're trying to make the best of our situation." "Yes, it is." Nia's words exploded through the space, sharp enough to cut. "You taught us never to trust anyone. You said people only help when they want something. But now we're living in his fancy house. eating his fancy food, and you're letting him play daddy like the past 7 years never happened. Like all those nights in shelters meant nothing. Daniel moved toward the voices, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He found them in the living room, Naya's face flushed with anger, her dark curls wild around her face, Amira looking exhausted with shadows under her eyes. Layla and Simone huddled on the couch, watching with wide eyes, their hands clasped together. "Nia," Daniel said softly, stepping into the room, his presence causing an immediate shift in the air. She whirled to face him, her eyes blazing with 7 years of hurt. Don't you dare act like you care now." Her small hands clenched into fists at her sides, knuckles white with tension. "Where were you when we were hungry? Where were you when Mom had to work 3 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads? Where were you when she cried herself to sleep thinking we couldn't hear her through those thin shelter walls?" Each question hit Daniel like a physical blow, forcing him back a step, the truth of her words cutting deeper than any knife could. The raw pain in her voice stripped away his defenses, leaving him exposed to the full weight of what his absence had cost them, what his father's deception had stolen from them all. "You don't get to just show up with your money and your big house and make everything better." Nia's voice broke on the last word, tears finally spilling over. She spun around and ran to her room, the door slamming so hard the walls seemed to shake, the sound echoing through the penthouse like a gunshot. The silence that followed felt deafening, heavy with unspoken words and buried pain. Amira gathered Layla and Simone, gently guiding them to their room with whispered reassurances, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts and the crushing weight of his daughter's accusations. Hours later, after the penthouse had grown quiet save for the distant hum of the city below, Daniel sat down outside Naya's door. He leaned his head back against the wall, listening to the soft sounds of her moving around inside, the occasional sniffle betraying her tears. "I know you're awake," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I know you probably don't want to hear anything I have to say, but I'm going to talk anyway, if that's okay. You deserve at least that much." He paused, gathering his thoughts, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "You're right about everything. I wasn't there when you needed me. I missed your first words, your first steps, your first day of school. I missed holding you when you were sick or scared. I missed being the father you deserved. I missed everything that mattered." His voice grew thick with emotion, catching in his throat. "I can't change any of that. I can't go back and fix what was broken. But I swear to you, Nia, I will never walk away again. Not from you, not from your sisters, not from your mom. I know you don't believe me yet, and that's okay. I'll prove it to you every single day until you do, even if it takes the rest of my life." Inside the room, Nia lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing the shadows cast by streetlights below. She didn't respond to his words, but for the first time since they'd arrived at the penthouse, she didn't cry herself to sleep. Instead, she listened to the sound of her father's steady breathing on the other side of the door, wondering if maybe, just maybe, he meant what he said. The familiar bell above the door chimed as Daniel and Amira stepped into the dusty tome bookstore. The scent of old books and coffee wrapped around them like a warm blanket, stirring memories of study sessions and stolen kisses between shelves. Afternoon sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. Daniel watched as Amira ran her fingers along the spines of worn books, her expression softening at the familiar touch. "Remember how we'd hide in that corner?" she asked, pointing to a secluded nook near the philosophy section. "You'd quiz me on constitutional law while I tried to teach you about Jane Austen." Her voice carried a hint of the joy they'd once shared, though tinged with something deeper now. Daniel smiled, but his eyes held a deep sadness. "I remember everything." He guided her to their old spot, now occupied by mismatched armchairs instead of the beaten-up couch they'd known. The faded burgundy fabric was frayed at the edges, much like their own worn history. "Amira, please tell me everything. No more secrets between us." She sank into one of the chairs, her hands twisting in her lap. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. She told him how Walter had called her to his office one day, his smile cold and calculating as ice. How he'd shown her photos of her mother at work, of her younger sister at school, casual shots that carried clear threats. How he'd made it clear, leave Daniel, or watch her family suffer. "But that was just the beginning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The afternoon light caught the tension in her face. "When I refused to give up, he got creative. My scholarship suddenly revoked, my mother fired from her job of 15 years. Every law firm I applied to, they all rejected me within hours. It was like watching my future disappear piece by piece." Daniel's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. His father hadn't just separated them, he'd systematically destroyed every chance Amira had at building a life. Each revelation felt like a physical blow. "I was 3 months pregnant when I realized what was happening," she continued. "By then, I had nothing left. No home, no job, no future. The shelters became our life. I worked whatever jobs I could find, cleaning offices at night, serving coffee before dawn. Anything to feed our girls." Her voice cracked with the weight of memories. Tears slid down her cheeks as she described the endless nights of uncertainty, of holding 3 crying babies while trying not to cry herself, of watching other mothers in the shelter share their food with her daughters when she couldn't afford enough, of the constant fear that child services would take her girls away, how she'd lie awake listening to their soft breathing, terrified of losing the only precious thing she had left. Daniel stood abruptly, his body trembling with rage and grief. In 2 steps, he was pulling Amira into his arms, holding her like he'd never let go again. The familiar scent of her hair brought back a rush of memories, making his heart ache even more. "I swear, Amira, I'm going to make him pay for this." She pulled away, wiping her eyes, and shook her head. The determination in her gaze was stronger than any anger. "It's not just about revenge, Daniel. It's about making sure he can never do this to anyone else. We need to stop him. Not just for us, but for everyone he might hurt." Daniel nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about justice, about protecting others from the cruel manipulation his father wielded like a weapon. The quiet bookstore around them seemed to hold its breath, witnessing their shared moment of resolve. Walter Mercer sat in his dimly lit study, swirling aged scotch in a crystal tumbler. The evening shadows stretched across Persian rugs and mahogany furniture, but the darkness in his eyes was deeper still. His son's defiance had caught him off guard, but Walter hadn't built an empire by accepting defeat. The family portrait on his desk, Daniel at graduation standing stiffly beside him, seemed to mock his current predicament. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found Judge Harrison's number. The man owed him several favors, and more importantly, had connections within Child Protective Services. Walter's lips curved into a cold smile as he dialed, his manicured fingers tapping rhythmically against the leather armrest. "James, I need something handled." Walter's voice was smooth as silk. "There's a woman, Amira Bennett, 3 children. I need a case opened. Neglect would be most fitting, given her history." He paused, listening to the response. "Yes, the usual arrangement will suffice. Make it happen tonight. We need to move quickly on this matter." Meanwhile, in Daniel's penthouse, peace had settled over the family like a warm blanket. Amira sat on the plush living room carpet, helping Layla with her math homework while Simone dozed on the couch, her dark curls spilling across a decorative pillow. Even Nia had softened enough to let Daniel show her how to play chess, her brow furrowed in concentration as she contemplated her next move. The sharp knock at the door shattered their tranquility like glass breaking. 2 women in business attire stood in the hallway, their expressions professionally neutral, clipboards clutched to their chests. "Ms. Bennett, I'm Sarah from Child Protective Services. We're here regarding a report filed about your children." Her colleague, a stern-faced woman with graying hair, nodded silently beside her. The color drained from Amira's face, her hands instinctively reaching for her daughter's. Behind her, Daniel stepped forward, instinctively placing himself between the social workers and his family, his shoulders squared and jaw tight. "We've received serious allegations of neglect," Ms. Chen continued, her voice steady as she glanced around the luxurious apartment. "Given your history of unstable housing and employment—" Her eyes lingered on the obvious signs of wealth surrounding them. "This is ridiculous," Daniel cut in, his voice tight with controlled fury. "These children are well cared for. Anyone can see that." His hand found Amira's shoulder, squeezing gently. But Amira knew better than to argue. Years of survival had taught her how the system worked, how it could be manipulated by those with power and influence. She gathered the girls close, her hands trembling but her voice steady as she answered the social worker's questions. Layla pressed against her side, while Simone clutched her hand, eyes wide with fear. Daniel watched, his rage building with each passing moment. He knew exactly who was behind this, could see his father's manipulative fingerprints all over this latest attack. The timing was too perfect, the accusations too precisely aimed at Amira's past struggles. His mind was already racing through solutions, contacts to call, lawyers to summon. When the social workers finally left, promising follow-up visits and investigations, Amira collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. The triplets huddled around her, confused and frightened by the tension in the air. Naya's eyes blazed with anger while Layla tried to comfort a quietly crying Simone. Daniel knelt before them, taking Amira's cold hands in his. His voice was steel and fire when he spoke. "They will not take our daughters. I will burn the world before I let that happen." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, a tender contrast to the fury in his words. Looking into his eyes, Amira saw not the polished businessman or the billionaire's son, but the man who had once promised to love her forever. For the first time in 7 years, she believed him completely. The wall she'd built around her heart began to crack just a little. The CPS worker, Ms. Reed, stepped into the penthouse with measured steps, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome counting down precious seconds. Amira felt her daughter's hands tighten around hers, their small fingers digging into her palms with the desperate strength of frightened children. Simone pressed her face against her mother's leg, trying to make herself invisible, while Nia's eyes narrowed with defiance, her chin jutting out in a mirror image of her mother's strength. Daniel moved forward, his presence commanding the room as naturally as breathing. "I want to see the complaint," he said, his voice firm but controlled, years of boardroom negotiations evident in his tone. "Now." Ms. Reed hesitated, clutching her clipboard closer to her chest as if it were a shield. "Mr. Mercer, these proceedings are confidential." "Show me the complaint," Daniel repeated, not backing down, his shoulders squared and ready for battle. "It's our right to know what we're being accused of." After a moment's pause, Ms. Reed relented, handing over the paperwork with slightly trembling fingers. Daniel's eyes scanned the document, his jaw tightening with each line he read, the muscle there jumping with suppressed anger. The accusations were laid out in stark black and white. Long-term homelessness, unstable living conditions, inability to provide a proper environment for the children. Each word felt like a personal attack. The familiar cold rage settled in Daniel's stomach like a block of ice. He recognized his father's work, the careful selection of words, the strategic targeting of Amira's past struggles, the precise timing of it all. Every detail was calculated to paint her as an unfit mother, a masterpiece of manipulation. "We'll need to conduct a thorough investigation," Ms. Reed explained, her voice professional but not unkind, her eyes darting between the parents. "This will include regular home visits and private interviews with the children." Amira stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined, like a violin string pulled too tight. "I've done nothing wrong. My girls are safe." She lifted her chin, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. "They've always been safe with me." Daniel moved to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers in silent support, a physical reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. "This is clearly a false report," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, steel beneath silk. "I want the name of who filed it." "I'm sorry, but that information is confidential," Ms. Reed replied, straightening her jacket nervously. "We're required to investigate all reports, regardless of their source." Daniel's expression hardened into granite. He might not be able to get the name officially, but he had other ways. Resources, connections, people who owed him favors. He would find out who filed the report, though he already knew the answer like a bitter taste in his mouth. After Ms. Reed left, Amira sank onto the pristine white couch, burying her face in her hands as if trying to hide from the world. The triplets gathered around her like protective satellites, their small faces pinched with worry. "This is what your family does, Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking like glass. "They destroy lives." Daniel knelt in front of her, gently taking her trembling hands in his touch as careful as if he were handling something precious and fragile. "Not this time, Amira," he promised, his voice fierce with determination, a warrior ready for battle. "I promise you, I will never let them take our daughters." Sometime later, Daniel's footsteps echoed through the marble halls of the Mercer estate, each step carrying the weight of his fury. The familiar paintings and antiques that lined the corridors now seemed like mockeries of wealth and power, symbols of everything corrupt in his father's world. Family portraits spanning generations stared down at him with cold, judging eyes, their gilt frames gleaming in the fading daylight. He found Walter in his private study, lounging in his leather chair like a king on his throne. The crystal tumbler of whiskey in his hand caught the evening light, amber liquid swirling as Walter took an unhurried sip. The room smelled of expensive cigars and old books, a scent that had once meant comfort, but now turned Daniel's stomach. "You tried to take my daughters from me." Daniel's voice cut through the room like Arctic wind, sharp and merciless. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat fueled by rage and betrayal. Walter didn't even blink. Instead, his lips curved into that familiar smirk that had always made Daniel's skin crawl. "If I wanted them gone," he said, setting down his glass with deliberate care, "they'd be gone." The crystal made a soft clink against the polished wood, the sound somehow more threatening than a shout. The casual cruelty in those words made Daniel's blood run cold. He watched as his father stood up, straightening his perfectly tailored suit with practiced ease. Every movement was calculated, controlled, just like everything else in Walter's carefully crafted world. "Let me make this simple for you," Walter continued, walking around his massive mahogany desk. His Italian leather shoes whispered against the Persian carpet. "I don't want custody of those girls. What I want is much simpler. Amira gone." Daniel's hands clenched at his sides, knuckles white with restraint. Walter noticed, and his smirk widened, a predator sensing weakness in his prey. "She is a stain on our name, Daniel." Walter's voice dripped with disdain. "Walk away from her and the girls stay with you. Fight me." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air like poison gas. "And I will drag her through the mud until she has nothing left." Bile rose in Daniel's throat as the full weight of his father's words hit him. The man who had raised him, taught him about business and power, was treating Amira and their daughters like pieces on a chessboard, just bargaining chips in his endless game of control. The weight of years of manipulation pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. "You think I won't go to war for them?" Daniel stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his voice low and dangerous. The scent of his father's expensive cologne filled his nostrils, a smell that would forever remind him of this moment. Walter didn't move an inch, completely unfazed by his son's anger. His eyes gleamed with something close to satisfaction as he replied, "Oh, I'm counting on it." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, the expression of a man who believed he held all the cards. In that moment, Daniel saw it clearly. This wasn't just about Amira anymore. His father's calm demeanor, the calculated threats, the careful manipulation. Walter was playing the long game, and he was prepared for every move Daniel might make. The realization settled over him like a shroud, heavy with the knowledge that this confrontation was only the beginning of a much larger battle. Daniel stepped out of the elevator into his penthouse, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his confrontation with Walter. The moment he entered, he felt the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, like a storm about to break. Amira sat rigid on the couch, her eyes distant and worried, fingers absently twisting the hem of her shirt. The girls were quieter than usual, picking up on their mother's distress like little emotional barometers, their usual laughter and chatter noticeably absent from the space. Simone spotted him first. She scrambled off the floor where she'd been coloring, her crayons scattered across her half-finished drawing, and ran to him, arms outstretched. Daniel caught her automatically, his body already adjusting to the familiar weight of his youngest daughter. She buried her face in his shirt, her small fingers clutching the expensive fabric, her warm breath coming in quick, anxious puffs against his chest. "Are they going to take us away?" Her voice was tiny and trembling, muffled against his chest, carrying all the fear a child should never have to feel. Daniel's heart cracked. The pain was physical, sharp and real, like shattered glass in his chest. He held Simone tighter, looking over her head at Lila and Nia, who watched from across the room with matching worried expressions, their young faces carrying shadows too heavy for their years. No child should have to live with this kind of fear, he thought. These girls had already endured so much uncertainty in their young lives, bouncing from shelter to shelter, never knowing what tomorrow might bring. Later, after the girls were settled in their rooms with whispered assurances and extra tight hugs, Daniel found Amira in the kitchen. She stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself like armor, staring out at the city lights that twinkled like distant, unreachable stars. He told her everything, about Walter's true intentions, about the ultimatum that felt like a knife against his throat. "He's not after the girls," Daniel explained, his voice tight with anger that threatened to boil over. "He's after you. If you leave—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the words sticking in his throat like thorns. Amira turned to face him, an almost hysterical laugh bubbling up from her throat, bitter and sharp. "That's what he wants? For me to disappear?" She shook her head, dark curls swaying with the motion. 7 years wasn't enough for him? 7 years of struggling, of fighting just to keep my head above water? "I would never ask you to do that," Daniel said firmly, taking a step toward her, his hands clenched at his sides to keep from reaching out. "Never." Amira's eyes met his, searching his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Would you still fight this if the triplets weren't yours?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications, weighted with years of pain and doubt. The question hit Daniel like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He stood there, stunned by its weight, by everything it represented, by the hurt behind the words. That night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, Daniel sat alone in his office, surrounded by the soft glow of his desk lamp. The DNA results lay on his desk, unopened, the envelope slightly crumpled at the corners from being carried in his pocket all day. The official proof that the girls were his daughters was right there in that envelope, waiting to be revealed. But as he stared at it, he realized something profound. He didn't need it. He'd known from the first moment he saw them huddled with Amira in the rain, 3 identical faces looking up at him with a mixture of fear and hope. He would fight for them, fight for her, with or without that test, with everything he had. His fingers traced the edge of the envelope, feeling the weight of the truth inside, the truth that would legally bind him to his daughters, but wasn't necessary for his heart to know what it already did. These were his girls, his family, and he would move heaven and earth to protect them, regardless of what any piece of paper might say. The morning light filtered through the penthouse windows, but it brought no warmth to Amira's heart. She paced the living room, her movements sharp and agitated, like a caged animal. The past few days had worn her down, each moment adding another brick to the weight she carried. She could see it affecting the girls too. Nia's increased defiance, Layla's withdrawal, and Simone's constant need for reassurance. When Daniel walked in from his morning call with the lawyers, something in Amira snapped. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said, her voice trembling with exhaustion and anger. "You dragged us back into your world, and now, look what's happening." Her hands shook as she gestured around them. Your father is trying to take my children. CPS is investigating me. Everything I've built, everything I've protected, it's all falling apart because I let you back in." Daniel stood quietly, watching her with those intense eyes that seemed to see right through her. But instead of defending himself or arguing back, he simply moved closer, his presence steady and calm in the face of her storm. "I trusted you," she continued, her voice breaking. "I trusted you then, and look what happened. 7 years, Daniel. 7 years of nothing but struggle and pain." He didn't speak. Instead, he reached out and pulled her into his arms. At first, she resisted, her body rigid with tension, but slowly, like ice melting in the sun, her defenses began to crack. "Do you know what it was like?" she whispered against his chest, the fight draining from her voice. "Living in shelters with 3 newborns? Working 2 jobs while 8 months pregnant just to afford food?" The tears she'd been holding back for so long finally spilled over. "There were nights I couldn't feed them properly. Nights we had to sleep in my car because the shelters were full." Daniel's arms tightened around her, but he remained silent, letting her speak. "I used to look at them sleeping and cry because they deserved so much better than what I could give them. Better than donated clothes and food bank meals." Her voice cracked. "Sometimes, I'd see happy families in the park, and it hurt so much I couldn't breathe. Because our girls should have had that. They should have had everything." She felt Daniel's chest rise and fall with a deep breath. "Every time Nia got sick, I was terrified because I couldn't afford a doctor. When Layla needed glasses, I had to choose between paying rent or helping her see properly." The memories poured out of her like a broken dam. And Simone, she was so tiny, so fragile. There were nights I stayed awake just watching her breathe, terrified she wouldn't make it. Daniel's hand moved to stroke her hair, gentle and soothing. The simple gesture of comfort made her cry harder, years of stored pain finally finding release. "I tried so hard to be enough for them," she whispered. "But every day I knew they deserved more than a mother who could barely keep them alive." Daniel pulled back slightly, his hand coming up to tilt her chin. His eyes were wet with unshed tears as he looked at her. "You are the strongest woman I've ever known," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. At those words, something final broke inside Amira. She collapsed into his arms, letting go of the strength that had kept her standing for 7 long years. For the first time since that rainy night when her world fell apart, she allowed herself to be held, to be vulnerable, to be comforted. The morning sun painted warm stripes across Amira's face as she sat at the breakfast table. Something felt different today, lighter, as if sharing her pain with Daniel had lifted a small piece of the burden she'd carried for so long. The gentle clinking of spoons against bowls filled the kitchen with a peaceful rhythm as she watched the triplets eat their cereal. Simone was making silly faces at Daniel, milk dribbling down her chin, while Layla quietly read a book propped against the milk carton, occasionally pushing her glasses up her nose. Even Nia seemed less angry this morning, though she still avoided looking directly at Daniel, focusing intently on stirring her increasingly soggy cereal. A sharp knock at the door shattered the peaceful moment. Daniel rose from the table, his bare feet padding across the hardwood floor. When he opened the door, a courier in a crisp uniform handed him a thick manila envelope, his expression professionally blank. Daniel's fingers tore through the seal, the ripping sound harsh in the quiet kitchen. As he read, his jaw tightened, the muscles in his face growing hard and rigid. The paper crinkled in his grip, his knuckles turning white with tension. "What is it?" Amira asked, her heart already knowing the answer, dread settling in her stomach like lead. "Walter." Daniel's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "He's filed for emergency custody of the girls." The room went silent. Even Simone stopped playing with her cereal, her spoon frozen halfway to her mouth. Amira's hands trembled as Daniel passed her the papers, the edges already wrinkled from his tight grip. Her eyes scanned the cruel, clinical language. Raised in unstable conditions. Biological mother lacks the financial means. Legal guardianship should be transferred to the Mercer family. Each accusation felt like a personal attack, designed to paint her as an unfit mother. Each word felt like a knife twisting in her chest. The room started to spin, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, the wood digging into her palms. "He's going to take them from me, Daniel." Her voice came out as a broken whisper, thick with unshed tears. Daniel knelt beside her chair, his hand covering hers, warm and steady against her trembling fingers. "No, he won't." His voice was firm, certain, carrying the weight of a promise. "But we have to fight this in court. We have to face him head on." Amira looked at her daughters, her beautiful, resilient girls who had survived so much already. Nia was watching her with worried eyes, trying to appear strong even though she was scared, her bottom lip caught between her teeth. Layla had set down her book, her small hand reaching for Simone's under the table, offering silent comfort as they always had for each other. Something shifted inside Amira as she gripped the papers tighter, feeling the edges bite into her skin. 7 years of running, of hiding, of being afraid. It ended now. She looked at the accusations again, but this time they didn't terrify her. This time they made her angry, igniting a fire in her chest that burned away the fear. She was done being Walter Mercer's victim. For the first time since that rainy night when he'd destroyed her life, Amira wasn't afraid of him. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and met Daniel's steady gaze. She was ready to fight, ready to show Walter Mercer that a mother's love was stronger than all his money and power combined. Daniel sat in his home office, surrounded by a team of high-powered attorneys. Their expensive suits and leather briefcases seemed out of place against the backdrop of children's drawings now decorating his walls, colorful stick figures and hearts that brought warmth to the otherwise austere room. Lucas stood by the window, his tablet in hand, ready to present their findings, his usual confident demeanor tinged with nervous energy. "Walter has influence everywhere," Daniel said, his voice tight with frustration, running his fingers through his disheveled hair. "He's got judges in his pocket, politicians on speed dial. We need something concrete, something he can't make disappear, something that will stick." Lucas nodded, swiping through documents on his tablet, his forehead creased in concentration. "We've been digging. Your father's been careful, but he's not perfect. There are patterns. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, shell companies that don't quite add up. The deeper we look, the more we find." One of the lawyers, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, leaned forward, her manicured fingers tapping against the polished conference table. "We found irregular payments dating back decades. The amounts are significant, but they're hidden under layers of legitimate-looking transactions. It's clever, but not clever enough." In the living room, Amira sat with a kind-faced social worker named Marie, who was helping her prepare for the upcoming home evaluation. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap as she answered practice questions, her wedding ring catching the afternoon light. "How did you manage their education while being homeless?" Marie asked gently, her pen poised over her notepad. Amira's voice shook slightly, her shoulders tense. I made sure they attended school regularly. We stayed close to their school district, even when we had to move between shelters. I helped with homework every night, even if we were sitting on shelter beds. Sometimes we'd use the library until closing time." Daniel, passing through, overheard her struggling to justify her choices. He paused in the doorway, his heart aching at the pain in her voice. "Amira," he said softly, taking a step toward her, "you don't have to prove you're a good mother. You already are. Everything you did was for them." She looked up at him, her eyes wet with unshed tears, a small smile tugging at her lips. The simple truth in his words seemed to steady her, like an anchor in rough waters. Back in the office, Lucas and the legal team continued their investigation with renewed determination. They combed through years of financial records, looking for the thread that would unravel Walter's carefully constructed facade. Empty coffee cups littered the desk, testament to their dedication. Hours passed. The sky outside turned dark, and the triplets were long asleep, their soft breathing echoing through the baby monitor on Daniel's desk, when his phone lit up with Lucas's call. "We found something," Lucas's voice crackled through the speaker, urgent and excited. "A sealed file that Walter buried. And it's bad. The kind of bad that even his connections can't fix." Daniel's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the phone until his knuckles turned white. They had finally found what they needed. the key to destroying his father's empire of lies. The weight of what was coming settled heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time in months he felt hope. The courtroom's polished wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators as Walter Mercer strode in, his expensive Italian suit perfectly pressed, his silver hair immaculate. He carried himself with the practiced ease of someone who had won countless battles in rooms just like this one, his shoulders squared with unwavering confidence. His smile, directed at the judge, was grandfatherly and warm, a masterful performance of concern that had fooled so many before. Amira sat rigid beside Daniel, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. The triplets were at home with Lucas, spared from witnessing this battle, but their absence felt like a physical ache in her chest. She could almost hear their laughter, see their smiles. The thought of losing them made her feel hollow inside. Walter's legal team went for the jugular immediately. They painted Amira's past in harsh strokes: the homeless shelters, the unstable addresses, the lack of steady employment. Each word felt like a knife, twisting deeper, reopening old wounds she'd fought so hard to heal. "Your Honor," Walter's lawyer said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, his designer suit rustling as he gestured dramatically. "Ms. Bennett has shown a consistent pattern of instability. The children deserve better than sleeping in shelters and living hand to mouth. We must consider their future." Daniel couldn't stay silent any longer. He stood, his voice steady but charged with emotion, his tall frame commanding attention. "Your Honor, if I may speak?" At the judge's nod, he continued, his words carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "My father orchestrated this entire situation. He deliberately kept me in the dark about my daughters. He manipulated both of us, destroyed lives for his own agenda." Daniel's words rang through the courtroom as he detailed Walter's interference, the blocked communications, the sabotaged opportunities, the systematic destruction of Amira's future. His voice cracked when he spoke about the lost years, the birthdays he missed, the first steps he never saw, each memory stolen from him forever. The judge, a stern-faced woman with reading glasses perched on her nose and gray streaks in her dark hair, listened intently. Her expression gave nothing away as she reviewed the documents before her, but something in her eyes suggested internal conflict, a weighing of consequences. After what felt like hours, she cleared her throat, the sound sharp in the tense silence. "Given the complexity of this case, I'm ordering a full custody evaluation. We'll reconvene once the evaluation is complete. Court is adjourned." The words landed like lead in Amira's stomach. A full evaluation meant more time, more scrutiny, more opportunities for Walter to exert his influence. Her throat tightened with fear for her daughter's future. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Walter passed by Daniel's chair, his expensive cologne hanging in the air between them. He leaned down, his breath warm against Daniel's ear as he whispered, his tone dripping with smug satisfaction. "I told you, son. I always win." Daniel's hands clenched into fists, rage burning through his veins like liquid fire. But instead of lashing out, he reached for Amira's hand, gripping it tightly, feeling her trembling fingers steady against his. His voice was low but fierce as he promised, "Not this time, never again." Lucas paced restlessly in the dimly lit private office, his usual composed demeanor completely replaced by nervous energy as he meticulously spread documents across the polished mahogany desk. Daniel stood motionless by the window, his reflection ghostly against the evening cityscape of glittering buildings and distant lights. "This is it, Daniel," Lucas said, his voice tight with anticipation, fingers drumming against the wooden surface. "These documents, they're a complete roadmap of your father's corruption. Look at this." He jabbed his finger at a series of suspicious bank transfers, his hands trembling slightly. Offshore accounts, judge payoffs, all of it carefully hidden through layers of shell companies. Daniel's jaw clenched as he leafed through the damning papers, his knuckles white against the crisp edges. Each page revealed another devastating layer of his father's manipulation, like peeling back an endless onion of deceit. There were detailed emails discussing Amira's scholarship removal, explicit correspondence with law firms warning them not to hire her, and meticulously kept financial records showing systematic payments to keep her permanently blacklisted. He systematically destroyed her, Daniel whispered, his hands shaking with barely contained rage. Every single door she tried to open, he slammed shut in her face. Lucas nodded grimly, running his fingers along the edge of another incriminating document. And that's not all. These records show he's been using Mercer Innovations for illegal dealings for years. Money laundering, insider trading, it's all documented right here. Daniel grabbed his phone, his fingers already flying across the screen as he drafted a message to his media contacts. We release this tonight. Every major news outlet gets a copy. No. Amira's voice cut through the tension like a knife. She stood in the doorway, her expression determined and unwavering. We can't waste this on a media circus. Daniel turned to her, confusion etched across his features. But this could destroy him immediately. Amira stepped forward into the room, her voice steady and resolute. And he'll spin it, call it fake news, claim it's manipulated. No. She picked up one of the documents, studying it carefully. We use this where it matters most, in court where he can't hide from it. Lucas ran his hand through his disheveled hair, pacing faster now. She's right. But we need more than paper trails. We need someone who can testify to all of this firsthand. Daniel fell silent, his mind racing through possibilities. Then his eyes widened with sudden realization. My mother, he said quietly, hope creeping into his voice. She's been there for everything. She would know all of it. Would she testify? Amira asked, her voice soft with doubt and concern. Daniel pulled out his phone again, this time dialing a number he rarely used. To his surprise and relief, Evelyn answered on the second ring. Mother, he said, his voice tight with tension. We need to meet. It's important. There was a long, weighted pause on the other end. Finally, Evelyn's carefully controlled voice came through. The garden house. 1 hour. Later, in the secluded garden house behind the sprawling Mercer estate, Evelyn sat perfectly poised in her high-backed chair, her elegant appearance and perfectly pressed clothes, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere hanging in the air. Daniel methodically laid out their evidence, explained their detailed plan, and finally asked the question that could change everything. Will you testify against him? Evelyn's perfectly manicured hands tightened around her delicate bone china teacup, her knuckles turning white with pressure. She looked at her son with unreadable eyes, years of carefully guarded secrets and silent pain swimming in their depths. You have no idea what you're up against, Daniel. The dimly lit cafe buzzed with quiet conversation, but at their corner table, the silence felt heavy enough to touch. Daniel and Amira sat side by side, facing Evelyn Mercer across a small round table adorned with delicate china cups. The afternoon light filtering through gauzy curtains cast soft shadows across their faces, highlighting the tension in their expressions. Around them, other patrons chatted over their lattes and pastries, oblivious to the life-changing conversation unfolding in their midst. Evelyn's perfectly manicured fingers traced the rim of her teacup, her wedding ring catching the soft overhead light. Her composed exterior couldn't quite hide the slight tremor in her hands. She looked every bit the polished society wife she'd been trained to be, but there were cracks showing in her armor today. The pearl necklace at her throat seemed to weigh heavily, like a gilded chain. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but firm. We need you to testify against him. His eyes held a mix of determination and concern as he watched his mother's reaction. A muscle twitched in his jaw, betraying his own tension. Evelyn's laugh was soft and bitter like dried leaves scraping against pavement. You think it's that easy? She stirred her tea methodically, the silver spoon clinking against fine china. That I can simply walk into court and tear down the empire your father built? Her words carried decades of carefully buried pain. The pearls at her throat shifted as she swallowed hard. The weight of unspoken years hung between them as Evelyn's carefully maintained facade began to crack. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the perfect posture faltering. I've known for years what Walter was capable of, the people he's crushed, the lives he's destroyed. She glanced at Amira, guilt flickering across her features. I watched it all happen, and I said nothing. Her voice caught on the last word. Her designer scarf suddenly seemed more like armor than accessory. Daniel pressed on, his jaw set with determination. This is your chance to do the right thing, to finally stop him. His hand tightened around his own cup, knuckles whitening with suppressed emotion. The steam from his untouched coffee spiraled between them like unspoken words. Evelyn's hands trembled more visibly now as she set down her cup. "If I testify," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cafe's ambient noise, "Walter won't just go after me. He'll destroy everyone I care about, including you." Her eyes met Daniel's, filled with years of fear and resignation. "You don't understand what he's capable of." She smoothed her silk scarf with nervous fingers, a habit formed over decades of maintaining appearances. Amira, who had been quietly observing, suddenly leaned forward. Her voice was steady, carrying the weight of 7 years of struggle. "He already is." She held Evelyn's gaze. "He's already trying to take my daughters, your granddaughters." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. A nearby customer's laughter seemed jarring against their intense conversation. The word granddaughters seemed to pierce through Evelyn's carefully constructed walls. She closed her eyes briefly, her breath catching. A single tear threatened to disturb her perfect makeup. The afternoon sun caught the moisture in her eyes, making them shine with unshed tears. When she opened them again, she looked directly at Daniel. "If I do this," she paused, the words seeming to cost her greatly. "I need protection from my own husband." Her fingers clutched her napkin, twisting the fabric into tiny pleats. The diamond on her ring finger caught the light one last time as she made her decision. Daniel nodded without hesitation. "Then let's make sure he never has power again." His voice carried the weight of a promise, and beneath the table, his hand found Amira's, squeezing it gently. The touch was both a comfort and a silent vow. They would face whatever came next together. The morning sun had barely risen when Daniel's phone buzzed on his nightstand, casting an eerie blue glow in the dim room. He reached for it, still groggy from a restless night filled with worries about Walter's next move. The caller ID showed his private banker's number, and something in his gut told him this wasn't a routine call. "Mr. Mercer, I apologize, but there's been a situation." The banker's voice was tense, almost trembling. "All your accounts have been frozen, pending a federal investigation into suspected fraud. We were served the papers just minutes ago." Daniel sat up straight, fully awake now, his silk pajamas suddenly feeling cold against his skin. His heart pounded as he listened to the details, each word hitting like a hammer. Every account, every asset, everything he'd built outside of Mercer Innovations, all of it was suddenly untouchable, locked away by faceless bureaucrats wielding rubber stamps. In the kitchen, Amira was helping the girls with breakfast, pouring milk over cereal bowls and checking homework folders one last time, when Daniel walked in, his face ashen. Lucas had already texted him confirmation of what he feared. Walter had pulled strings, claiming suspicious activity in their finances. The old man's fingerprints were all over this, even if they couldn't prove it. "What's wrong?" Amira asked, catching his expression, her maternal instincts instantly on alert. The girls looked up from their cereal, spoons suspended midair, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the sunny kitchen. Daniel pulled her aside, speaking in hushed tones near the coffee maker. "Walter froze everything. Our accounts, assets, all of it. He's made his move." The color drained from Amira's face. She gripped the granite counter for support, her knuckles turning white against the speckled stone. "Everything?" Her voice cracked, thick with fear. "But how will we—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Memories of past hardships flooding back, nights in shelters, counting pennies for food, the constant fear of losing everything. No, Daniel said quickly, pulling her into his arms, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "We're not going back there. I won't let that happen. Not to you, not to our girls." But Amira was already spiraling, her body trembling against his. "We have nothing, Daniel, nothing. He's going to win. He's going to take the girls." He's desperate, Daniel cut in firmly, though his own heart was racing beneath his crisp white shirt. He knows we're getting close to something. That's why he's doing this now. This isn't strength, it's fear. His phone buzzed again, vibrating against his hip. Lucas's message made his stomach drop. Walter's lawyers had filed a motion to expedite the custody case. If granted, they'd have barely any time to prepare their defense, barely any chance to fight back. Daniel stepped away from Amira, dialing Lucas's number with slightly shaking fingers. His voice was steel when his friend answered, all traces of uncertainty masked. Find me leverage. Anything we can use to end him before he buries us first. Whatever it takes. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor, painting stripes of gold and shadow. In the background, the girls continued eating their breakfast, their spoons clinking against ceramic bowls, unaware that their world was once again hanging by a thread, balanced on the edge of their grandfather's razor-sharp ambitions. The tension in the penthouse was becoming unbearable, seeping through walls and under doors like a heavy fog, thick enough to make breathing difficult. Nia, always alert and protective of her sisters, pressed her ear against the wall separating their bedroom from the living room, her heart pounding with each muffled word. The adults' voices carried through, words like accounts and custody, making her stomach twist into painful knots. She pulled back, her dark eyes wide with worry, and motioned for her sisters to follow her into their shared bedroom. Layla came quietly, her footsteps careful and measured, but Simone dragged her feet, clutching her worn teddy bear, the one she'd had since she could remember, its fur matted from years of tears and hugs. Once inside, Nia closed the door softly, wincing at even the smallest click of the latch. The three girls huddled together on Simone's bed, their matching faces reflecting different levels of understanding and fear, a mirror of emotions ranging from outright terror to confused concern. Are they taking us away? Simone's voice was barely above a whisper, her small fingers digging into the bear's matted fur, twisting and pulling at the worn fabric. The question hung in the air like smoke, choking them all with its weight, making the room feel smaller by the second. Naya, who had always been the strong one, the protector, felt her tough exterior cracking like thin ice. Her hands trembled as she pulled her sisters closer, feeling their warmth against her sides. For once, she didn't have an answer, didn't know how to make it better. The fear she'd been holding back started to seep through, showing in her eyes despite her best efforts to hide it, betraying the confidence she always tried to project. Later that night, when the penthouse had grown quiet and dark, the only sound the distant hum of the city below, Daniel found Nia sitting alone in the living room. She was curled up in one of the oversized chairs, looking smaller than her years in the shadows, her knees pulled tight against her chest. The city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a soft glow across her face, highlighting the tracks of dried tears on her cheeks. Daniel hesitated in the doorway, unsure if he should intrude on her solitude, his hand gripping the doorframe as he wavered. But before he could decide, Nia's voice cut through the darkness, sharp and clear. "Do you even want us?" The question was raw, vulnerable, so different from her usual defensive tone, stripped of all her careful barriers. She didn't look at him as she asked it, her eyes fixed on the city beyond the glass, watching the endless dance of lights below. Daniel felt his heart shatter into a million pieces, each shard piercing him with regret and determination. The pain in her voice, the doubt. It was like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He moved across the room and knelt beside her chair, close enough to show he cared but not so close as to make her uncomfortable, respecting the invisible boundaries she'd drawn. "You're my daughters," he said, his voice rough with emotion, each word weighted with promise. "I will fight for you until my last breath." He meant every word, the truth of it burning in his chest like fire, consuming every other thought and priority. For a long moment, Nia said nothing, the silence stretching between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Then, for the first time since he'd entered their lives, she didn't pull away or put up her walls. Instead, she leaned slightly toward him, her shoulder just barely touching his, the contact small but significant. In the darkness, her whisper was both a challenge and a plea. filled with all the longing she usually kept hidden. Then fight harder. The courtroom buzzed with tension, filled to capacity with spectators, lawyers, and press. The air felt thick with anticipation, heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. Walter Mercer sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit crisp and perfect, a picture of wealthy confidence. His team of attorneys flanked him like guards, their briefcases bulging with carefully prepared arguments, their faces set in practiced expressions of controlled certainty. Daniel squeezed Amira's hand as they waited, feeling her pulse race beneath his fingers. The triplets were at home with Lucas, safe from this moment that would determine their future, protected from the storm that was about to break. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and a collective gasp rippled through the room like a wave. Evelyn Mercer walked in, her head held high, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Her designer suit, usually worn like armor, seemed to hang differently on her frame today. For the first time since the proceedings began, Walter's composure cracked. His face drained of color, and his fingers gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white, the first visible sign of weakness in his carefully maintained facade. When Evelyn took the stand, her voice was clear and steady, carrying across the hushed courtroom. Each word rang with years of pent-up truth. "I've stayed silent for too long," she began, meeting Walter's eyes directly. "But I can't watch my husband destroy another family." She detailed years of Walter's corruption, her testimony precise and devastating, like arrows finding their mark. He bribed judges in multiple jurisdictions. He had Amira's scholarship revoked, her mother fired, and blacklisted her from every law firm in the state. The paper trail leads directly back to his office. Walter's lawyers jumped to their feet, objections flying. But Evelyn continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. He intercepted every attempt Amira made to contact Daniel. Emails, phone calls, letters, all destroyed before Daniel could see them. I watched him burn the letters myself. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs, the sound like angry bees. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks, their pens scratching against paper like claws. Walter's face had turned from pale to red, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful, a muscle twitching beneath his left eye. "He told me it was for Daniel's own good." Evelyn's voice cracked slightly, emotion finally breaking through her composed exterior. But he was wrong. He stole 7 years from his own son, from his granddaughters. He denied them a father, security, love, all because it didn't fit his plan, all because he couldn't bear to lose control. Walter's lawyers were in chaos, papers flying as they desperately tried to control the damage, whispering urgently among themselves. But their objections fell flat against Evelyn's clear, factual testimony. She had dates, documents, specific conversations, all carefully preserved over years of silent observation, a secret archive of Walter's crimes. The judge, a stern woman who had seemed unmoved by previous arguments, leaned forward in her chair, her expression grave. Her reading glasses caught the fluorescent light as she studied the evidence before her. After Evelyn finished, the judge adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Walter, her gaze sharp and unforgiving. "Given the new evidence," she declared, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, "this court will reconsider custody proceedings. The gravity of these allegations cannot be ignored." Daniel watched his father's face crumble, the mighty Walter Mercer finally facing something he couldn't control or manipulate away. The man who had manipulated lives like chess pieces was watching his carefully constructed game fall apart, piece by piece, his kingdom of lies collapsing under the weight of truth. Walter Mercer sat in his private study, the leather of his chair creaking as he leaned back, staring at the courtroom reports scattered across his mahogany desk. The setting sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, darkness creeping in just like the loss of control he felt, slipping through his fingers. His usually pristine desk was a mess of papers, each one documenting his public fall from grace. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his crystal tumbler of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the fading light. The testimony from Evelyn had been devastating, but Walter Mercer didn't become who he was by accepting defeat. He still had connections, favors to call in, pieces left to play in this game. With deliberate movements, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. Judge Harrison had owed him for 20 years. 3 rings, then a cautious answer. "I need this fixed," Walter said, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't care what it takes." Across town, in Daniel's penthouse, the atmosphere was lighter than it had been in weeks. The triplets sprawled on the plush carpet, actually giggling as they played a board game. Simone's laugh, bright and carefree, filled the space. Even Nia had let her guard down, her usual scowl replaced by a small smile. Amira stood in the kitchen preparing dinner with Daniel's help, though his idea of helping mostly involved getting in her way and stealing tastes of whatever she was cooking. For the first time since this nightmare began, they felt like they could breathe. "The girls seem happier," Daniel murmured, watching their daughters play. Amira nodded, stirring the pasta sauce. "They can sense it. Things are finally going our way." Daniel reached for plates to set the table, the domestic normalcy of the moment making his heart swell. But just as they were about to sit down for dinner, the elevator dinged. Lucas burst into the apartment, his face flushed, tie askew, clutching a legal document in his hand. "It's not over," he gasped out, trying to catch his breath. Walter just pushed for an emergency ruling. The peaceful atmosphere shattered. The girls stopped playing, sensing the sudden tension. Amira's hands trembled as she took the document from Lucas, her eyes scanning the legal jargon. Her face drained of color. "The judge is expediting the final custody ruling," she whispered, her voice hollow. "The hearing is tomorrow morning." Daniel moved to her side, reading over her shoulder. Walter was making one final, desperate move, forcing a quick decision before they could fully leverage Evelyn's testimony. The triplets huddled together on the carpet, their game forgotten. Simone clutched her sister's hands, while Nia's protective scowl returned full force. Layla, always the quiet observer, watched her parents with worried eyes. "He's trying to rush the judgment before we can file the new evidence properly," Lucas explained, loosening his tie. "He's calling in his last favors." Amira sank into a kitchen chair, the legal document crumpling slightly in her grip. All the hope and relief they'd felt just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. Tomorrow. They had until tomorrow to prepare for the final battle. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as Judge Harrison settled into his chair, barely glancing at the stack of evidence before him. His disinterest was clear. He'd already made up his mind. The afternoon sun filtering through the tall windows cast harsh shadows across his weathered face. Walter's lead attorney, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit, stood with practiced confidence. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she approached the bench. "Your Honor, despite Mrs. Mercer's emotional testimony, we cannot ignore the facts. Ms. Bennett spent years raising these children in homeless shelters and unstable environments. The Mercer family can provide stability, education, and opportunities these children deserve." Her words rang out with calculated precision, each syllable designed to wound. Amira gripped the edge of her chair, her knuckles white. Each word felt like a physical blow, reopening old wounds she'd fought so hard to heal. Beside her, Daniel's jaw clenched as he watched his father's calculated destruction unfold, his hands balled into tight fists in his lap. The triplets sat in the front row with Lucas, their small faces solemn. Simone clutched her stuffed bear, its fur worn from years of tears and worry, while Nia's eyes blazed with anger that seemed too mature for her young face. Layla kept her gaze fixed on her mother, as if trying to give her strength, her fingers nervously braiding and unbraiding the end of her sweater. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, ignoring his lawyer's attempt to stop him, shrugging off the restraining hand on his sleeve. "Your Honor, may I speak?" His voice carried through the hushed courtroom. Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively, checking his watch. "Make it quick, Mr. Mercer." Daniel walked to the center of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing in the silence, his voice steady and clear. 7 years ago, my father stole something precious from me, the chance to be a father. He erased every trace of Amira, blocked every attempt she made to reach me. He left her alone and pregnant, fighting against a system he controlled. He turned to look at his daughters, his heart swelling with love and regret. While I lived in luxury, Amira worked multiple jobs. While I ran a billion-dollar company, she skipped meals so our daughters could eat. She didn't fail them, she fought for them every single day. His voice cracked slightly, emotion bleeding through his careful composure. I walked away from Mercer Innovations, from billions of dollars, from everything I've ever known. Not because I had to, but because I chose my family over my father's empire. These girls aren't a possession to be claimed. They're my daughters. And Amira? She's the strongest person I've ever known. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, looking bored, shuffling papers on his bench. While that's very touching, Mr. Mercer, the fact remains. The courtroom doors burst open with a bang that made several people jump. Lucas rushed in, clutching a manila folder, slightly out of breath, his tie askew and forehead gleaming with sweat. Daniel's heart raced as Lucas handed him the folder, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent understanding. He knew what this was. Their last chance. He stepped forward and placed it on the judge's bench with trembling fingers. "Before you rule, Your Honor, read this." Across the room, Walter Mercer's face drained of all color, his usual mask of control crumbling. For the first time in the entire proceedings, real fear flashed across his features. He knew exactly what that folder contained, and the knowledge made him look suddenly old and vulnerable in his expensive suit. Judge Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he opened the manila folder, his weathered fingers catching on the worn edges. The courtroom fell into a thick, anticipatory silence, broken only by the soft rustling of papers and the occasional creak of wooden benches as spectators shifted in their seats. His eyes widened as he scanned the first page, then quickly flipped to the next, and the next, each turn of paper echoing in the hushed chamber. The documents told a damning story that even he, with his 30 years on the bench, found shocking. Wire transfers to offshore accounts, meticulously detailed. Email chains discussing payoffs, written with casual arrogance. Bank statements showing systematic bribery of court officials spanning nearly 2 decades. Each page revealed another layer of Walter Mercer's corruption, laid bare in black and white, a web of deceit that stretched far beyond what anyone had imagined. Whispers rippled through the courtroom as the judge's face grew increasingly grave, his usual judicial mask slipping to reveal genuine dismay. Several members of the gallery leaned forward, straining to catch a glimpse of the papers that had caused such a dramatic shift in the atmosphere, their curiosity practically tangible in the air. Walter sat rigid in his chair, his usual composure cracking like thin ice under pressure. His fingers dug into the arms of his seat, knuckles white with tension, expensive suit no longer sitting quite so perfectly on his frame. For the first time, real fear flickered across his face as he watched his carefully constructed world begin to unravel, thread by damning thread. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, removing his glasses with shaking hands and placing them carefully on the bench before him. "In light of this new evidence, I am compelled to order a full investigation into these allegations of judicial misconduct and corruption." His voice carried through the silent courtroom, growing stronger with each word. "These documents suggest a pattern of bribery and manipulation that cannot be ignored, stretching back far too many years." Daniel watched as his father's face transformed, feeling a complex mix of grief and relief. The smug certainty that had dominated Walter's expression throughout the proceedings melted away like snow in sudden sun, replaced by stunned disbelief. The mighty Walter Mercer, who had controlled everything and everyone for so long, was finally losing his grip on power, his empire of influence crumbling before their eyes. The judge's gavel cracked against the wooden block, the sound sharp and final, like a gunshot in the tense atmosphere. "Given these extraordinary circumstances, I am ruling against Mr. Walter Mercer's petition for custody. The children will remain in the care of their biological parents, Amira Bennett and Daniel Mercer, where they clearly belong." 2 court officers approached Walter, who sat frozen in his chair, his face ashen and drawn. As they escorted him toward the exit, his shoulders slumped, his usual commanding presence diminished to a shadow of itself. The man who had wielded his power like a weapon now looked small and defeated, age finally showing in every line of his face. Amira clutched Daniel's hand, tears streaming down her face as she watched Walter's departure, years of fear and uncertainty finally releasing their hold on her heart. The triplets rushed forward from their seats, wrapping their arms around their parents in a tangle of relief and joy. Nia, who had been so resistant to trust, buried her face in Daniel's suit jacket, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, while Simone and Layla clung to their mother, their faces glowing with happiness. Walter paused at the doorway, turning back one last time, his hand resting on the heavy wooden frame. His eyes met Daniel's across the courtroom, and in that moment, father and son both knew Walter Mercer's reign of control was finally over, leaving behind a family stronger for having survived his machinations. The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees, scattering golden leaves across the sprawling lawn of the colonial-style house. It wasn't the towering penthouse where they'd started their journey back to each other. This was something warmer, more intimate, a real home. Simone's delighted squeal pierced the air as she chased a butterfly across the grass, her dark curls bouncing with each step. Layla had already claimed a spot under an old oak tree, her notebook open as she sketched the scenery around her. Even Nia, who had been so guarded for so long, was exploring the garden with undisguised wonder, her fingers trailing over the late-blooming flowers. Daniel stood on the wraparound porch, taking in the sight of his daughters, truly happy for the first time. The house was nothing like the luxury high-rises he'd grown up in. It had character, history, and most importantly, room for his family to grow. The white paint might have been a little worn in places, and the shutters needed fixing, but that's what made it perfect. It was real, just like their love. Amira stepped out onto the porch, her eyes soft as she watched the girls play. The past few weeks had brought color back to her cheeks, peace back to her spirit. She turned to Daniel, studying the way his face lit up as he watched their daughters. The smile he wore wasn't the polished corporate one she remembered from their college days. It was genuine, unguarded, full of pure joy. "You really gave it all up for us," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. Daniel turned to her, taking her hand in his. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache. "It was never a choice, Amira," he said softly. "It was always you." The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting long shadows across the lawn. The girls' laughter echoed through the yard as they chased each other through piles of fallen leaves. This moment, this perfect slice of peace, was everything they'd fought for. Daniel squeezed Amira's hand once before letting go. His heart thundered in his chest as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Slowly, he lowered himself to one knee, looking up at the woman who had held his heart for all these years. Amira's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. The last rays of sunlight caught the diamond as Daniel opened the box, making it sparkle like captured starlight. "I lost you once," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "I won't lose you again. Marry me." Tears spilled down Amira's cheeks, but these weren't the tears of pain or fear she'd shed so many times before. These were tears of joy, of coming home, of finally finding peace. "Yes," she answered without hesitation, her voice clear and certain. The triplets, who had stopped their play to watch, erupted in cheers. Their excited screams filled the air as Daniel slipped the ring onto Amira's finger and stood, pulling her into a kiss that held 7 years of longing, of fighting, of never truly giving up on their love. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel and Amira, I handpicked this next story that you will love. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel and Amira, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Don't miss it. Click here to watch it.